The views and opinions expressed in this video are those of the speakers and panelists, and do not necessarily reflect the position of the ETHOS Institute for Public Christianity and its founding institutions and organizations.
Is Jesus God?
Migrant workers and human rights from a Christian perspective.
Marriage and family.
ISIS presents a much bigger threat.
How do we integrate the Bible with our scientific understanding?
Are you able to actually describe and articulate clearly your own sense of purpose in life?
But it's a pleasure to be here. I think this is my third interaction with ETHOS. I like the idea of public Christianity. I think religions should not be inward looking, particularly when Christianity is not a majority faith. And I think it's important that people understand the role that religions can play in a society. So in the interest of time, just let me begin my presentation. Just in case we get lost or I get lost, these are the three arguments that I have to put forth this evening. They really come more as themes. And I make the case that in Singapore, the constitutional framework provides for religion as a civil liberty. And indeed, it is an important civil liberty because without religious freedom, I think it's difficult to speak of individual and societal flourishing. But religion as a civil liberty, doesn't function on its own. It has to interact with other civil liberties, right? So in the same way as we exercise religious freedom, we need also the other freedoms that are afforded. For example, the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly, among other things. But I think what is critical is how these civil liberties are practiced will matter immensely. Do these liberties, are they practiced in a way that promotes the greater good, or are they really confined for the benefit of only a small group? And I suppose with the repeal of Section 377 of the Penal Code, there could be concerns about whether religious liberty or religious freedom, would come under threat. My own sense is that it shouldn't, but it would require people of faith, to ask themselves what sort of values and norms we need to imbibe in order to navigate, the post-377A landscape in Singapore. So I essentially make the point, which shouldn't come as a surprise to most, if not all of you in this room. When we think of civil liberties, which is very much a Western legal construct, it is essentially about freedom from undue governmental interference or restraints. And of course, we know in Singapore that liberties are not absolute, right? Religious freedom can be restricted, on certain grounds that are provided for in the Constitution. In Singapore, we tend to speak of fundamental liberties rather than civil liberties or civil rights. And in the Constitution, the fundamental liberties are found in Part 4 of the Constitution. And religious freedom, right, is found in Article 15 of the Singapore Constitution. So what I put up here is Article 15 of the Singapore Constitution, I think we should be generally feel assured, that the freedom of religion is something which is provided for in the Constitution and which I would argue is taken seriously, right? Not just by Singaporeans, but also by the authorities. I wouldn't, in the interest of time, I wouldn't I wouldn't read out the freedom of religion provision. But I think what is more important is for me to just try to talk about the trinity of freedoms that are provided for in Article 15. So Article 15 provides for every person with the right to profess and practice his religion and to propagate it, right? The 3 Ps, as I often like to describe them, right? It's easy to remember: profess, practice, and propagate. Profession essentially just means, the ability to choose a religion or not to have one. It also includes the right to be able to change your religious affiliation. It could also be as simple as, being able to declare, that I'm a Christian, for example. Practice, of course, is what is essential, right, in many faiths. Practice would include individual practices of our faith, but all religions, to the best of my knowledge, also have emphasized the congregational dimension, right? People coming together to pray, to worship, and that's important, I think, right? Because we want to be part of a larger assembly. And the third freedom, right, is the right to propagate your religion, right? And many religions do encourage, to varying degrees, people of their faith to spread the teachings. And I think, if you think about the Singapore context, if there's a particular good place for a certain food, we all like to tell people about, this particular place for whatever delights, culinary delights that it offers, right? We don't keep the good things to ourselves. But the Constitution also provides in Article 15, Clause 4, where the state can restrict religious freedom only on 3 grounds. Right? One is on public order, the second ground is on public health, and the third is on morality. In terms of the jurisprudence, the cases that have come before the court, they have primarily centered on public order. We don't really have that much jurisprudence on public health or morality as such, and I think that may not be a bad thing altogether. The religious landscape in Singapore, I describe it as rich, diverse, and complex. And I think it stems from the basic fact that ours is a very diverse religious society. Buddhism may be the largest religious group in Singapore, but there are more non-Buddhists than Buddhists. Right? And I'll show you the statistics in a bit. In 2014, the Pew Research Center, which is a Washington, D.C.-based research center, very reputable, described Singapore based on the methodology that it adopts, the different size of the different religious communities. They describe Singapore as the most religious diverse country or society. That was in 2014. In 2015, they did another study, and they found that there were very high government restrictions on religion in 2013, because they were looking back at a particular year. And later in 2015, in another study, they anticipated that the growth of the Hindu and Muslim populations will grow significantly in the years ahead. But be that as it may, right, I think the first two observations to me are not contradictory. I think when you have a very religious, diverse society, it becomes even more important for there to have that framework of rules and norms, to ensure that religious freedom doesn't become a source of conflict. But more recently, the Pew Research Center in 2023 did a study on religious pluralism in several Asian countries. And I've just picked out four salient observations that they've made. I do apologize that the print is small, but I'd be happy to share the slides with any one of you, who want to have the deck of slides. But essentially, what the Pew Research Center noted is that religious diversity in Singapore is remarkable on a global scale. They noted the high level of tolerance that Singaporeans have for people who come from different faiths. And among the respondents, 6 in 10 say that they have, quote, a personal connection, unquote, to at least one religion other than their own, right? And again, it shouldn't surprise us. While about 2/3 of those respondents also identified with a religion, believe that many religions can be true at the same time. I must say this particular observation comes as a surprise to me, right? Because we all tend to think that, our religion is the only way to salvation, to eternal life, or what happens when you get to the other side of eternity. But it does reflect well in my view. And of course, given the diversity, Singaporeans also do not think that their religious beliefs form a substantial part of their national identity. Right? So I think that's critical, because if the national identity is associated with a particular religion, then I think the national identity citizenship will not be as inclusive as it could be and as it should be. And when we come to highly religious Singaporeans, these are those who believe religion to be very important in their lives. These people are generally very supportive of national diversity, believing that it makes the country a better place to live, right? And I think that reflects very well on how Singaporeans view religious freedom, how we feel about living in a religiously diverse society, that we're all free to believe in what we want to. In this particular table, I put together the religious composition of our country since the first national census was conducted in 1980. Generally, it's been quite stable. I think one observation is that people are clearer as to whether they are Taoist or Buddhist. I think we can all identify with relatives and all, particularly those of us who are ethnic Chinese, that there used to be a syncretic form of Buddhism and Taoism practice. And of course, over the years, I think people feel that they need to be clear what faith they belong to. But if you track over the last 40 years, you will see Christianity having the largest gain of about 9%. But not too far behind is also the growth of people who do not subscribe to any religion. And to be clear, in a census, when they say no religion, they're not referring to atheists, right? It's just people who do not feel that they are affiliated with any particular religion. And you will see, that it's fairly diverse, right? I mean, these are the mainstream religions, but you don't have, Buddhists, for example, being overwhelmingly, large, right? And I think that does contribute to the sense that it is not so much about numbers, but about how you practice your religion. And so when we think about the faith landscape in Singapore, again, in the interest of time, I will just say what they are, because in case those of you at the back may not be able to see. But we know that there is some overlap between race, religion, and language. So if you think about the Malay community in Singapore, right, 99% of them are Muslims, and the dominant home language would be Malay. It is perhaps a bit more diverse where the ethnic Chinese community is concerned, but there is that overlap. And in Singapore, the way the Muslim community is described is sometimes they use the term Malay stroke Muslim. And another observation is that the religious piety has increased across all faiths. I think that's something which would be apparent to some, if not most of us. But I suppose I wouldn't be surprised if some of you feel that maybe this might be an exaggerated description, right? But there appears to be the case that there is increased religious piety across all faiths. Another observation about the faith landscape is that we do have quite a rich array of laws, that relate to the regulation of religion, and I think it's this the existence of this variety of laws that led the Pew Research Center in 2015, to say that there are numerous restrictions on religion in Singapore. I think there are restrictions, right? But the question is whether they get in the way of people being able to exercise their religious freedom. And another observation is that the authorities do recognize, that people of faith can act as a sort of a moral conscience in society, and how we often look at government policies or laws, that sometimes we do view them through a religious lens, and that's to be expected, right? Because religion would inform some of the most important decisions, that we may make. I'm going to skip this slide, but the key point here is that I prefer to use the term secularity to describe the church-state relationship in Singapore rather than secularism, because there are many different types of secularism, and secularism tends to suggest that there is a strict distinction between religion and state. But we know that in Singapore that is not really the case. As I will explain in a short bit. And how is secularity, manifested in Singapore, right? So on the one hand, there is indeed the attempt to separate religious institutions and state institutions, but it is also manifested in religion having a secure place and a role in the public square. I don't think that there's any doubt in that, right? Religious groups are free to put forth their concerns about laws and policies in Singapore to the authorities. There is nothing to say that, if this from a religious perspective, you are not entitled to a seat at the table. There is the general understanding that the two spheres should be kept separate, so there should be no religious interference, no interference by the authorities in religious matters, and likewise, religious personalities, should not get involved, should not get involved in the domestic politics. But strangely enough, although we are what we call a secular state, there is nothing in the Constitution that prohibits the government of the day from establishing a particular religion. That is, making a particular religion a state or official religion. And likewise, there is also no provision that mandates the separation of state and religion. But we all know that religion is very much, a fabric of our society, right? So if you think about the public holidays that we have in Singapore, most of them are religious, are important religious days. When you consider social assistance that is provided by Singaporeans, many of them do it out of faith-based organizations. And if we consider mission schools, again, they do play a very important part, in the religious landscape, right? And of course, when you think about places of worship in Singapore, they are very much a part of our landscape, right? And we are in a neighborhood where I think within a 1 to 2 kilometer radius, right, there are so many different places of worship from different faiths. I don't know whether many of you realize that there's a Shia mosque, on Hill Street, next to the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, right? So it's very much something which I think has been part of our fabric, and hopefully, we can continue with that. But the uniqueness of secularity in Singapore is really, the state's recognition that religion does have the power to mobilize and to socialize believers, whether it's for moral, social, economic, and political ends. And how the state goes about trying to harness religion for the purposes of nation and state building is something which will always be under fairly close watch. So what I'm trying to drive at is that it is a fairly pragmatic and accommodative secularity or governance when it comes to religion, church-state relations. I also want to draw to your attention, the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. While it was previously, concerned with religious communities, the amendments in 2019 have also made it an offense for religious groups, to target others on account of religion or religious beliefs. But by the same token, right, it is also potentially an offense if a particular individual or group is targeted because of his or her or their religious affiliation, right? So there is that even-handed approach, right? But the main idea is that there shouldn't be the urging of violence or use of force against any person on account of their personal attributes. So what I've tried to paint so far is, that religious liberty is indeed present in Singapore, right? We may have concerns about whether there is a lack of it. We may feel that perhaps there should be more of it. But I would say that religious liberty is secure in Singapore. But of course, with the repeal of 377A, I think there are in some quarters the concern that civil liberties could contest, or rather could compete, if not conflict with each other. So the question of whether 377A could result in the tenor of society changing quite rapidly. My conclusion for now is that it need not be the case, because I think when we look at 377A, the repeal and the constitutional change that was introduced as well, I would argue that it maintains largely the status quo. Yes, homosexuality is now decriminalized, and I think that's something that has the support of most Singaporeans. Decriminalizing, homosexuality. But the repeal of 377A, right, obviously doesn't remove contending groups' deepest disagreements, right? And that shouldn't surprise us, right? Because if we could remove disagreements by passing law, we'll all be living in peace and harmony, right? But it doesn't work like this on this side of eternity. The changes to the law also does not at all require, for people of faith or for members of the LGBT community, to surrender their beliefs, their deep commitments, and their fundamental values. And the question of Article 156, right, which provides for the institution of marriage, I think is put there primarily, to ensure that if any government of the day wants to change the definition of marriage, they will have to be able to carry the ground. And so I think, that's something that will help to ensure, that if we decide to legalize same-sex unions or marriage, that's something that, the majority of society is comfortable with. So I would say that, in a post-377A landscape, we certainly need to forge, a new consensus, right, as to how we can reconcile, as well as to accommodate, the evolving social mores, of our society. The changes as I see it, and I've written about this in newspaper op-eds, is that I don't think the changes are meant to unleash any drastic shift in our societal norms, but rather I think they seek to manage the pace of societal change on a very deeply divided issue, and where the government is concerned, it's certainly to try to balance the different legitimate views and aspirations among Singaporeans. So this is Article 156 of the Constitution, right, which is titled, Institution of Marriage. What it does primarily, right, is to say that, the definition of marriage is something for Parliament to decide, right? It is not for the courts to say what a marriage should be or ought to be, or what a marriage is, right? It is really for Parliament, through the political process of engaging with different stakeholders to come to a national consensus on whether the definition of marriage should change. Article 156 also makes the case that, that the existing definition of marriage, does not infringe Article 12 of the Constitution, right, which is to do with equality before the law and equal protection of the law. Why is there this concern where the government is with regards to the government? I think essentially, with the repeal of 377A, there is the concern that there could be litigation on marriage equality, right? That at the moment, only heterosexual couples can get married. And so the question of whether the so-called lack of marriage equality would infringe Article 12 of the Constitution, which provides for equality before the law and equal protection of the law. So 156 protects the status quo. Well, maybe protects might be a bit of a strong word, right? But it maintains the status quo on marriage in Singapore. But it doesn't result in a situation where heterosexual marriages are hard-coded into the Constitution. Right? So there are countries which have put in a constitution that marriage is only between a man and a woman. Singapore has decided that is not the way to go. So marriage is actually defined in ordinary legislation, right? So you have the Interpretation Act, which talks about marriage as a voluntary union of one man and one woman to the exclusion of all others during the continuance of a marriage. And the Women's Charter talks about, the marriage being solemnized in Singapore has to be one between, a male and a female. But what it also means is that because the marriage is defined in ordinary legislation, it would mean that all you need to do to to amend the definition of marriage would be a simple majority in Parliament, right? But that does not at all suggest that it's easy, right? Because even if you have a party that holds more than 50% of the elected seats, they would still have to be able to carry the ground, right? So if society as a whole objects to the definition of marriage changing, then it will not do political favors for the government, right? And likewise, if Parliament doesn't change the definition of marriage where society feels that it ought to be changed, then again, the government of the day would have to be able to carry the ground on that particular resistance to change. So what is my provisional assessment? I think in the end, litigation is probably not the best way to go. If we look at the examples of other countries, right? In the US, for example, 9 men and women decide what is a marriage. I think we need a more inclusive process, right? Never mind if judges are very learned men and women. So the political process, where you can try to forge a consensus, right? Where you don't have, like in court litigation, where there's one winner and one loser, then I think that would work better for most societies. But the changes that were put in place last year, to me, they are really the easier part. I think making them work is the harder challenge, right? Because legal changes do not remove the principled disagreements that different groups may have. And so the challenge is, how do you continue to be in community with each other, even amid the deepest differences? So the changes to the law doesn't remove, what I call the collective action challenge, right? How society needs to move ahead. Because there will be concerns about whether the moral norms of society are moving a bit too quickly. How do we love our neighbor if he or she doesn't share our values? And while the law and legal system can provide, the structure and rules, they do not necessarily impart to us the requisite values and norms to build bridges across differences. So key issues remain, and I think it's not really an issue about the discrimination of contending groups, but it's really about fundamentally different conceptions of sex, marriage, parenting, and family. I don't think we will ever come to a consensus, right? These are issues that have been fought across millennia, right? So I don't think, I'm not too optimistic that in my lifetime, we will be able to come, to a national consensus. And they fundamentally reflect, very different views about the human condition, right? Something which all religions try to encourage us to find meaning and to, in a way, make peace, with what the human condition is and what it ought to be. But these issues obviously remain on the table, right? And this is where, as I come towards the end, it is important, that people of faith put their values into action. And I think fundamentally it is important for people of faith to have confidence in their beliefs and value system, to have that humble and open mindset, as well as that patient disposition, right, to engage meaningfully and charitably with others. I appreciate that it is not easy, but I think it's something which many religions do exhort, their believers to try. And because these divisive issues will continue to be with us, I think there is that urgency, to find purposeful ways of thinking enacting not only for ourselves, but also for others who are different from us. And I think this is, of course, the biggest challenge, right? How do we love someone who perhaps, holds very fundamentally different values from us, right? But I see it as, as being an imperative, right? Simply because we all have to live and thrive despite our despite our deep differences. I don't think combating is really the way to go, right? But of course, that doesn't mean that we do not hold fast to our values, to our principles and our beliefs system. So the quest really is to find that common ground of shared existence, right? I think the rules are still developing. We are still just slightly more than a year since 3770 was repealed and the Constitution, amended. But I do think, that religions, right, and particularly public Christianity, if I can describe it as such, do encourage us, to try to live and thrive, despite our deep differences. And again, I want to reiterate, this importance, that even as we try to accommodate others who are different from us, it doesn't mean that we have to sacrifice our ideals, our values, our beliefs, and our norms. So let me not try to attempt a conclusion, right? Because I don't think we'll ever be able to find a conclusion on this difficult issue. But I think the religious liberty that we have, should encourage us to try to find ways and means of loving our neighbor, and how we can manage our differences and yet still live in community. And I think it is true that, that different religions can demonstrate what it means by your faith. What does it mean to understand, to accommodate, and to thrive, even with people who are different from us. Because I do fundamentally believe, that ultimately the best of faith can overcome, the worst of mankind. Right? By that I mean our deepest prejudices, our biases, and the stereotypes that we too often fall prey to. Right? So thank you very much.